Well, what a day for South Africa. They are on the verge of a famous victory. They are just 69 runs away from winning the World Test Championship. An incredible partnership between Markram and Bavuma has got South Africa on the verge of a huge upset. And I talked about it in the lead up to this game that this would be such a boost for Test cricket in South Africa if they could win this. And they are very close to beating Australia at Lords. So, I'm Manners. Welcome to the Cricket Unfiltered podcast. I'm wrapping up day three of the World Test Championship. It didn't finish today. South Africa chasing 282 for victory, are 2 for 213. They need 69 more runs to win. Aiden Markram is 102 not out off 159 deliveries. He brought up his eighth Test century just before stumps. And Temba Bavuma, the plucky little South African skipper, is 65 not out off 121 deliveries, and they have put on 143 runs together in an unbroken third wicket partnership that has taken this game away from Australia. Australia started the day on 218. Australia started the day 218 in front, and they were 8 for 144, and they were bowled out for 207. They set South Africa 282 to win. Mitchell Starc was the top scorer, making 58 not out, a timely half century that got that target up to 282 when it seemed like it was going to be much lower. Don't forget, Australia was 7 for 77 on day two, and they managed to get 207. A costly drop the night before from South Africa when they dropped Mitchell Starc when he just before stump. So, uh, you know, an incredible day's cricket and a seesawing day's cricket. So before lunch, Mitchell Starc and Josh Hazlewood put on an excellent half century partnership. They frustrated South Africa, and while they were frustrating South Africa, I started to get worried because the pitch had died overnight. And, I was looking at the way Hazelwood was able to survive, and no disrespect to him, but conditions were very different today. In the first 2 days, we saw 28 wickets fall, 28 wickets fall. Today, we just saw 4 wickets fall. And yeah, I was really concerned when Hazelwood and Stark put on that partnership. I thought, geez, South Africa might have a chance at chasing this down. The pitch was still difficult to bat on. It was still moving and balls keeping low, but a lot of the pace had come out of it. The bounce had come out of it. Balls weren't carrying to slips, and it was just easier to survive. I wouldn't say it was a very good batting pitch, but it wasn't as difficult as it was on the first 2 days. Add to that, it was a hot day in London, almost 30 degrees. So good batting conditions, and yeah, after lunch, South Africa took on this 282 run chase, and they were very hard to stop, going to 2 for 213. It just looked totally different to the first 2 days. It was much better batting conditions, and the Australian bowlers, they hardly troubled the South African batters. There were obviously the 2 wickets and another chance off Bavuma, but apart from that, they looked pretty comfortable. So, um, some big news from today. Before we get into some of the highlights from the day, big news: Steve Smith, attempting to take a catch at first slip, dislocated his right little finger. It's a compound dislocation. He was taken to hospital. You would have to say now he's very doubtful for the West Indies Test tour. He certainly won't be fit for the first test. Matt Hayden in commentary said it was an 8-week recovery for a finger injury like that. So if that's the case, Steve Smith will miss the whole tour of the West Indies and hopefully be right for the Ashes. I did see at one point George Bailey come over and grab Andrew McDonald from the Lord's balcony. Maybe that's already thinking about who the replacement would be for Steve Smith on the West Indies tour. I had a look at that squad, and Nathan McSweeney is not in that squad, so you could see him being added to that squad as he's a top order player who they picked recently. Another one could be Curtis Patterson. But yeah, be interesting to see how Smith pulls up and who they call in to replace him. So with Australia on the verge of losing this game, I was thinking about what has cost Australia, what has got them into this position. And really it was the poor performance on day two in the afternoon in Australia's second innings. And across two innings, our top order just didn't perform. I read out the stats yesterday, but the top three batters between them across the whole test for Australia scored 49 runs. And Australia needed to get through yesterday afternoon to be batting today to be able to set a target of, well, in these conditions, it looks like you need a target of around 350 to really trouble the opposition. And the way the pitch is flattened out and in this good weather, it's much easier to chase. So Australia really stuffed it up um, with that collapse yesterday afternoon on day two. They just needed to survive and be able to have some batters still in the shed to set a difficult target. So, yeah, this could be a huge shock for Australia if they lose this match to South Africa, but it is a one-off game. And with 69 runs left, there still is a chance for a little wobble. I know I've said that basically writing off Australia from here. And the irony is I tipped Australia. Whenever I tip Australia to win, they don't win. I need to go back to always death riding them. Anyway, there is still 69 runs to get. And if Australia can get an early wicket tomorrow morning, maybe they can send a little shiver down the spine of the South African batters. They haven't shown any shivers at all. Markram and Bavuma were so composed. Bavuma injured his hamstring early on in his innings, and he just battled through. He was hobbling between the wickets, could hardly run. You know, it reminded me of Gordon Greenidge, who did it so often, or Steve Waugh, who did it at the Oval in 2001 in his final Ashes tour. And, you know, you have to beware the injured player. There's something about an injured player sometimes that they just end up focusing on survival. I don't know what, I can't explain it actually. I think it's because the injury maybe does something to their mental. I don't know, but you just got to beware the injured player. And Bavuma and Markram were so composed. But if Australia can get a wicket or two early on tomorrow morning, you never know. The pitch is keeping low. There's a lot of balls just dying, and you can tell the batters have to really be watching the ball because one's going to shoot along the ground. A lot of turn for Lyon and Head, the spinners we saw today. And Nathan Lyon was fairly ineffective today. He bowled 17 overs, unable to get a wicket, didn't really draw many chances. And, you know, that's concerning because we really needed him in these conditions and just wasn't able to extract any chances or the breakthrough. So yeah, just a fascinating day's play today. You couldn't have picked it after 28 wickets in the first two to only four today, and South Africa to be in a really dominant position now, and you know such heavy favourites going into day four tomorrow. Now, I was watching the commentary, I was listening to the commentary, and Dan Norcross, I love Dan, he's been on the podcast a few times, great guy, but I think he wanted tomorrow off because he kept talking about the day, the match finishing today. But as soon as Hazelwood and Stark batted through the first session, there was really no chance it was going to finish today unless Australia bowled South Africa out in two sessions. And even that was fairly unlikely the way the conditions were looking. So we will get a day four of the World Test Championship, and I'm glad we will because you know tomorrow could be a really tense little session if, as I said, Australia can knock over one of these players and get into Stubbs and then the rest of the batters. You just never know. All right, so let's just go through a few highlights from today. It started off with a somber moment where both teams wearing black armbands took a minute silence for the terrible for the victims of the terrible plane crash in Ahmedabad. We all saw that on the news, and appropriate that they would take a moment's silence before play. And then when play resumed, Lyon was out pretty quickly for two. Um, and that had Australia 9 for 148. That started at 8 for 144. And yeah, as I said, Stark was dropped the night before on 14, and he went on to make 58 not out. Mitchell Stark and Josh Hazelwood put on the highest 10th wicket partnership in any men's ICC final. They ended up putting on a 59-run partnership, terrific partnership before Hazelwood was out for 17. During that partnership, Mitchell Starc brought up his 11th Test half century. And it's a really interesting story about his batting. He made 10 half centuries in his first 52 Tests, but then in the last 6 years, he hasn't made another half century. And then finally, in his 97th Test, he brought up his 11th half century. So, he started off as a really almost an all-rounder with 10 half centuries in his first 52 tests, but this was a very important one. He was in partnership with his great mate Josh Hazlewood, and they got that lead up to 281. Eventually, Hazelwood was out to Markram, just poking a pretty innocuous delivery to cover, and Hazelwood was very disappointed to get out for 17. They looked pretty good, and it looked like they were going to bat through to lunch. And we're seeing the way South Africa batted, that every run Australia could get was crucial. But as I said on day one, shit gets wicket. Shit gets wicket sometimes. I know I used to have that theory when I was bowling. And as Mitchell Starc was the top scorer, 58 not out. Australia made 207 in the second innings to go with their 212 in the first innings. Other contributors with the bat for Australia, Alex Carey, a good 43, and Marnus Labuschagne with 22 at the top of the order, but really not enough runs there. Australia needed probably another 100, but at least another 80 or 90 from the top order to give them a good chance. So for South Africa, the bowlers, Kagiso Rabada, 4 for 59 in the second innings to go with his 5 wickets in the first innings, 9 wickets in the match for him. And if South Africa wins this game, he will have played such a huge role in delivering them this victory. I have to say, Rabada's quite an impressive chap. He was interviewed by the press after day one, and I haven't heard him speak much. I've heard him speak before. He's very well spoken. Both his parents are doctors, but I was struck by his maturity. When Australia played him 7 years ago in 2018, he was in his early 20s, a bit of a hothead and a firebrand, and, said a lot of dumb stuff. But he's matured, he's very level headed and quite likable. It's hard for me to say that about a South African, but it's true. He came across very well. And so 9 wickets for the match for him. Ngidi, 3 for 38 in the second innings, much improved performance from the first. And then Jansen, Mulder, and Markram all with 1 wicket. So South Africa set 282 for the win. I thought it would be too much for South Africa. I was pretty confident, but I was also a little nervous because of that last wicket partnership, which ended up being true. And for those wondering about this 282 run target, it's actually quite a common target in Test cricket. Rick Finlay had the stats on X. I didn't quite see them all, but that famous chase in Edgbaston in 2005 that Australia were chasing was 282, which is why it's such a familiar number for Australians and brings back a few bad memories. Anyway, so in the chase, South Africa lost Rickleton early. He was caught behind off a full swinging ball from Mitchell Starc. It looked like didn't look like a bump ball, but Rickleton just sort of edged it just after it bounced on the half volley, and Carey took a good catch. And then Cummins found Markram's edge when he was on 23, but it didn't carry to the slips and went past Carey for 4. And we saw the ball keeping low. The bowlers were starting to change their tactics and attack the stumps more to take advantage of the uneven bounce. But yeah, balls weren't carrying to the slips, and you could just tell it was easier to survive, as I said, but still you had to concentrate as the batters. So Mulder and Markram put on a really good partnership. Mulder batting at number 3 for the first time in Test cricket, and they took the score to 70. 1 for 70 at this stage. And then Mitchell Starc changed his tactics. He went around the wicket to Mulder, and first ball, he got him out. He just pushed the ball to cover, sort of a half drive, similar to Bavuma's dismissal in the first innings, and that ended their 61-run partnership. Mulder out for 27 off 50, and that brought Bavuma to the crease. And this was when we had that huge moment where Smith moved up to very short first slip because the ball wasn't carrying. He had a helmet on and he was very short, very close to Bavuma. And Mitchell Stark then got a ball to bounce to Bavuma. He edged it to Smith at slip, so it was quite high. And as Smith was so close, he just didn't have time to react and he dropped it. And Bavuma was only on two then, and that would have really changed the complexion of the game. But you cannot blame the Australians for moving closer. Balls had been just landing short of the slips all game. They had to be aggressive. They had to try something. But, well, not only is it cost them a wicket, but it could have cost them Steve Smith for a number of test matches now. And it was terrible footage when Smith dislocated his finger. He was in terrible pain. And I have to say, the response from the team and the physios was pretty slow to get to him. I was quite stunned. And even when they got to him, Smith was sort of biting his other hand because of the pain. They didn't have anything to give him. I was quite surprised at the treatment of Smith. I would have thought if I dislocated my finger like that, I would have wanted more assistance. But maybe I'm wrong. Look, I'm no medical expert, that's for sure. I'm just saying um, it was awful to watch. And yeah, you could see Smith walking through the Lord's long room, and he was biting his other hand because of the pain. So I feel really sorry for him. He's gone off for scans, and yeah, really doubtful for the West Indies. So Australia had finished their innings at the lunch break, and then in the second session, South Africa made 2 for 94, and they set up the chase nicely in that middle session. And then after the tea break, it was really South Africa's session. They scored none for 119 in that last session. They looked unstoppable, really, hardly any chances. And from there, they've got themselves into a position where they can probably win the game before lunch tomorrow. In that last session, Bavuma brought up his 50 off 83 balls, his 25th half century in Test cricket. And then just before stumps, Aiden Markram brought up his eighth century off 156 balls with 11 boundaries. So really good innings from Markram. They needed someone to step up, and he's done that in a huge stage. For Australia, Mitchell Stark, the wicket taker, 2 for 53. Josh Hazlewood, none for 43 from his 13 overs. Pat Cummins, none for 36 off his 10 overs. Nathan Lyon, 18 overs, none for 51. They really needed him to get a wicket and he just couldn't do it. Webster bowled 4 overs and Travis had 2 overs at the end. And I have to say it was noted on commentary as well, but Smith going off with his finger injury also wasn't ideal for the tactical side of the afternoon. Cummins leans on Smith's tactical nous a lot, and he wasn't there to assist Smith. Smith wasn't there to assist Cummins, so you know you could tell Australia were really, really missing him at the end of the day. And South Africa just too good at the moment. They look like they could bat themselves to a famous victory. And this would, I think, settle a lot of those choking nerves. If they can beat Australia in a World Test Championship final, then it would put to bed so many terrible chases and terrible cock-ups in all forms. I mean, we saw them do it in the T20 World Cup against India recently. Not a huge choke, but India played well, but they had a real opportunity there. And, if they could do it at Lord's, well, that would be very appropriate, because back in 1999, where this choking thing started at Edgbaston in that famous semi-final, it was played in England, and the winner of that game, or whoever, Australia got through to the final at Lord's and beat Pakistan. So, if South Africa could beat Australia at Lord's, well, it'd be some kind of story. So, South Africa chasing 282, a 2 for 213, 69 more runs to win. Bavuma 65 not out, Markram 102 not out, and steaming towards victory. And just closing thoughts on this, where this game stands. Just Australia's batting across the two innings, they weren't able to scratch enough runs together. The gamble of taking in an untried top order has failed. Khawaja, Labuschagne, Green as a top three. It just didn't work. We'll probably never see that in Test cricket again. That's the funny thing. For this World Test Championship, a final, a grand final, we'll probably never see Australia's top three again. I can't see them ever using that combination. I thought Smith should have batted at three. I said it before in the lead up to the game, and it probably does prove right. Having Green come in at three in both innings just left Australia's top order exposed. So a lot of food for thought for Australia. They need to really get their house in order ahead of the Ashes. Now with Smith looking like he'll miss the West Indies tour, it does give them an opportunity to maybe look at a few other options in the top order. Constas comes back in. I mentioned other names like McSweeney, Patterson. They can maybe start to form this order for the Ashes. But yeah, at this stage, it looks like South Africa are going to be the world test champions for 2025. No one wanted them in the final. They've tried to change the system so it doesn't happen again. So this would be a wonderful story. It's hard for me to say as an Aussie supporter, but this would be a great story and great for South African cricket and great for world cricket. They don't play a lot of test cricket, and maybe this will, inspire Cricket South Africa to get more test matches for South Africa. On the other hand, if they stuff it up tomorrow morning and don't win, that'll be fun to watch. All right, you've been listening to Cricket Unfiltered. That is my wrap of the World Test Championship Day 3. You might have noticed I released Day two's episode twice. There was a technical problem on my podcast platform that I use, and at 5 o'clock this morning, episodes were still processing. I couldn't delete them. So when I woke up, both had been released. I will try and only release one episode tonight. If you want to order some great Cricket Unfiltered merchandise, please check out all the details in the episode notes. We've partnered with a great company called Exactamundo, and they're offering great services. So I'll be talking about them a lot as the podcast moves on. But thanks everybody for listening to Cricket Unfiltered, and I'll be back after Day 4, probably live on YouTube. It'll be Saturday night here. It's probably going to finish at pretty good time, so I'll be able to do a live YouTube show with taking questions and reflecting on either a famous South African win or a famous South African choke.